Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If you disappeared from your job, your friend group, or someone's life tomorrow, how long would it really take before things went back to normal? Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And what you're about to hear might explain why most people avoid doing that. This video isn't here to blame you. It's here to show you the patterns that quietly turn presence into absence. And by the end, you'll understand why being irreplaceable has nothing to do with being louder and everything to do with being real. Let's start with the first sign, because it usually feels like a strength at first. Sign number 1. You're valued for being convenient, not essential. At first, this one feels like a compliment. People rely on you. They call when something needs fixing. They trust you to step in, smooth things out, keep things moving. You're the person who adapts quickly, the one who doesn't complain, the one who figures it out. And for a while, that feels like importance. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Being relied on is not the same as being irreplaceable. Convenience creates usefulness. Essential presence creates absence when it's gone. Think about how this usually plays out. You notice a problem before anyone asks. You handle it quietly. You don't make it a big deal. When things go right, there's no spotlight. When things go wrong, you take responsibility. And over time, people stop seeing you. They only see the function you perform. Carl Jung warned about this exact pattern when he said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Yet convenience is built on becoming a universal fit. You adjust your pace to others. You absorb pressure so others don't feel it. You make yourself easy to work with, easy to depend on, easy to overlook. Here's the subtle trap. The more seamless you are, the less noticeable your presence becomes. Imagine stepping away for a day, a week, a month. Not dramatically, not with conflict, just quietly. Would people ask what changed, or would they simply reorganize around your absence? That question stings, because most people don't realize they've trained others to function without them. You step in before you're asked. You don't state the cost of what you give. You rarely say no, so others never learn what it's like without you. Jung once said, "Where your fear is, there is your task." And the fear here is simple. If you stop being convenient, will you still be wanted? What can't be replaced is presence that changes the structure of a situation. But convenience never does that. It maintains the structure. It preserves comfort. This is why people who are constantly helpful are often the first to be swapped out when circumstances change. Not because they lacked value, but because their value was invisible. Sign number 2. You rarely push back or create friction. This sign is tricky because it's usually praised. People describe you as easy to work with, calm, reasonable, flexible. Someone who doesn't complicate things. And on the surface, that sounds like emotional intelligence. But here's the uncomfortable question most people never ask themselves. If you disappeared, what resistance would disappear with you? Because friction isn't just conflict, it's definition. When you never push back, your presence doesn't change direction. It just blends into momentum that already exists. Think about how this shows up in real situations. In conversations, you listen more than you speak. When you disagree, you soften it until it barely sounds like disagreement. You phrase your opinions like suggestions, disclaimers, or jokes. You tell yourself you're being mature, you're being considerate, you're choosing your battles. But over time, something subtle happens. People stop expecting you to challenge anything. Your silence becomes predictable. Carl Jung understood this dynamic when he said, The individual who does not defend himself against the collective opinion must perish. When you avoid friction long enough, your perspective loses weight, not because it's wrong, but because it never asserts itself. Consider group decisions. Plans get made, directions get chosen, standards get set. You notice flaws. You see consequences others don't. You sense when something won't work. But instead of speaking up clearly, you think, it's not worth it, or they'll figure it out, or I don't want to be difficult. So you let it go. And nothing changes. Not because your insight lacked value, but because it never entered the space with enough force to shape it. Jung believed personality forms through tension between opposites. Without tension, there is no development, only repetition. When you remove friction, you remove the very thing that makes your presence memorable. Here's the part people don't like to admit. People remember the ones who shift outcomes, not the ones who maintain comfort. When you never challenge assumptions, you become safe. But safety alone doesn't create significance. Jung warned that unresolved tension doesn't disappear, it relocates. When you consistently remove tension externally, it builds internally. You start feeling overlooked, unheard, replaceable. Not because people are ungrateful, but because your presence never demands adjustment. Think about the last time you clearly said no. Not indirectly. Not with explanations stacked on top of apologies. Just no. If that moment feels distant, this sign likely applies to you. Irreplaceable people aren't constantly confrontational. They're distinct. They allow disagreement to exist. They let silence stretch. They state positions without over-managing reactions. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In practical terms, that means allowing discomfort to surface instead of burying it under politeness. Sign number 3. Your identity is built around a role, not depth. This one feels stable at first. You know who you are in the room. You know what people expect from you. You know the part you play. And that predictability feels like security. You're the dependable one, the listener, the problem solver, the calm presence when things get messy. People come to you for that role, and it feels validating. It feels like belonging. But here's the question that slowly starts to surface. Who are you when that role isn't needed? Because roles create recognition, but they don't create attachment. Carl Jung warned about this when he said, "The persona is a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual." Most people don't realize when the mask becomes the face. You begin shaping your behavior around what's expected. You respond the way you're known to respond. You suppress parts of yourself that don't fit the image, not because anyone explicitly asked you to, but because consistency keeps things smooth. And slowly, your complexity gets compressed. Think about how this shows up in everyday situations. Someone asks how you're doing. You answer in character. Someone needs advice. You give the version you're known for. Someone crosses a line. You react the way you always do. Over time, people stop seeing you as a full person. They see you as a function, and functions are easy to replace. Because once your identity becomes predictable, your absence doesn't disrupt anything. Someone else just steps into the same role and keeps the system running. Jung believed that when people over-identify with a role, they lose contact with their inner life. They become efficient, but shallow. Useful, but interchangeable. You might notice this when change happens. If the environment shifts and your role becomes less relevant, you feel strangely untethered. If someone else starts doing what you do, you feel threatened, but you don't know why. If you're not needed in the same way, you feel invisible. Not because you lack value, but because your value was tied to a narrow function. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. People rarely miss the person behind the role if they never got access to them. They miss reliability. They miss consistency. They miss what you provided. But they don't miss you. And that realization hurts, because you've been showing up the whole time. Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Living inside a role is one of the most socially acceptable ways to avoid that confrontation. Roles protect you from risk. They protect you from rejection. They protect you from being misunderstood. But they also limit how deeply you're known. You don't surprise people anymore. You don't challenge their assumptions about you. You don't reveal new layers. And without depth, attachment weakens. Think about the people in your life who feel irreplaceable. They aren't defined by a single trait. They're complex, sometimes contradictory, sometimes difficult. You don't always know how they'll respond, and that unpredictability makes their presence felt. Depth creates gravity. Roles don't. Another sign this applies to you is how often you say, "That's just how I am." It sounds like self-awareness, but it's often self-confinement. You stop exploring who you could be. You stop expressing parts of yourself that don't match the label. You stop evolving in public. Jung believed individuation, the process of becoming oneself, requires breaking identification with the mask, not destroying it, but loosening it. When you allow yourself to be more than the role, friction appears again. Confusion appears. Adjustment appears. And that's a good thing. Sign number 4. You avoid expressing what you actually want. This sign often hides behind good intentions. You tell yourself you're flexible, that you're easygoing, that you don't need much. And on the surface, that looks like emotional maturity. But over time, something subtle happens. People stop knowing where you stand. Because if you never state what you want, there's nothing for others to lose. Think about how this shows up in everyday situations. Someone asks what you want to do, and you say, "I'm fine with whatever." A decision affects you, but you stay quiet because you don't want to create tension. A boundary gets crossed, and you let it slide because it feels easier than explaining yourself. At first, this feels cooperative. Later, it feels invisible. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Unspoken wants don't disappear. They quietly shape your behavior from the background. You start adjusting instead of choosing. You react instead of initiating. You wait instead of asking. And without realizing it, you train people to decide for you. Not because they're controlling, but because you never give them anything solid to work with. Here's the hard truth. People attach to clarity. When someone knows what you care about, what you won't tolerate, and what you're working toward, your presence gains structure. When they don't, you become adaptable, but forgettable. You might recognize this pattern in relationships. You give space without being asked. You compromise before anyone requests it. You assume others will notice your effort and meet you halfway. But they rarely do. Not out of malice, out of ignorance. They don't know what matters to you because you've never said it clearly. Jung understood that suppressed desire doesn't vanish. It turns inward. You might notice resentment building quietly, a sense of being overlooked, a feeling that you're always accommodating but rarely chosen. That resentment isn't a flaw. It's feedback. It's the signal that something essential hasn't been expressed. Another sign this applies to you is how often you say, "It's not a big deal." Sometimes it really isn't. But when it becomes your default response, It's often a way of minimizing yourself to maintain harmony. The problem is, harmony without truth creates distance. People don't feel close to someone whose inner world remains vague. They can't miss what they never touched. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Reaction requires exposure. If you never reveal what you want, what frustrates you, what excites you, nothing reacts. Everything stays neutral. Sign number 5. You're afraid of being seen as difficult. This fear usually doesn't feel like fear. It feels like self-control. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like knowing when to hold back. You tell yourself you're just low maintenance, that you don't want to be a problem, that you don't want to complicate things. But over time, something important gets lost. Because the fear of being seen as difficult often turns into the habit of being invisible. Think about how this shows up in real situations. You soften your opinions before sharing them. You add explanations and disclaimers so no one feels challenged. You apologize for taking up space, even when you have every right to be there. You might even pride yourself on being easy to deal with. But here's the uncomfortable truth. People don't bond deeply with those who never disrupt anything. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Becoming who you are requires friction. It requires contrast. It requires moments where others have to adjust to you. If you're always adjusting to everyone else, there's nothing to hold on to. This fear often starts early. You learn that approval comes from being agreeable, that attention comes from being helpful, that acceptance comes from not asking for too much. So you internalize a rule. Don't be the difficult one. And that rule follows you everywhere. In discussions, you hold back a stronger opinion. In decisions, you go along with what's already chosen. In conflict, you prioritize resolution over honesty. At first, this keeps things smooth. But smoothness comes at a cost. Over time, people stop checking in with you. They assume you're fine. They assume you'll adapt. Not because they don't care, but because you've taught them that you always will. Jung understood that when people suppress parts of themselves to remain acceptable, those parts don't disappear. They turn inward. You might notice a quiet exhaustion, a sense of being taken for granted, a feeling that your presence doesn't carry weight. That's not weakness. That's the result of being too accommodating for too long. Another sign this applies to you is how rarely you let situations become uncomfortable. Another sign this applies to you is how rarely you let situations become uncomfortable. You step into smooth tension. You redirect difficult conversations. You rush toward resolution. But tension isn't always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's information. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." In practical terms, that means allowing moments where others feel your disagreement, your standards, your limits. So, how to become irreplaceable without trying to impress? 1. Stop making yourself easy to absorb. When you're constantly adaptable, people don't feel your weight. You adjust your tone to match the room. You soften your reactions to avoid friction. You reshape yourself so nothing feels disruptive. This makes interactions smooth, but forgettable. Irreplaceable presence comes from allowing resistance to exist. Not constant resistance, not performance, but enough firmness that others have to respond to you, not glide past you. When people have to adjust, your presence registers. Jung believed that personality forms through tension. Without it, identity dissolves into function. The moment you stop making yourself frictionless, your presence gains gravity. 2. Attach your value to outcomes, not effort. Effort is invisible once results appear. You can work harder than anyone else and still be replaced, because effort can always be duplicated. What can't be duplicated is ownership. Irreplaceable people don't just help, they shape outcomes. They notice patterns. They make decisions. They take responsibility beyond their role. Jung warned that over-identifying with duty leads to inner emptiness. When you operate only from obligation, you become predictable. But when you think in terms of impact instead of effort, your presence changes the trajectory of situations. And trajectory is harder to replace than labor. 3. Make your inner standards visible. If people don't know your standards, they don't know what losing you would mean. You might have strong internal values, clear opinions, high expectations, but if they stay unspoken, they don't shape anything. Irreplaceable people let others feel their standards, not through lectures, through consistency. They don't over-explain. They don't negotiate their limits repeatedly. They allow others to adjust, or not. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. Your standards will never fit everyone. And that's the point. When people know where you stand, your presence has contour. Without that, it dissolves." 4. Let go of roles that no longer stretch you. Staying useful is not the same as staying relevant. At some point, the role that once gave you meaning starts shrinking you. You keep performing it because it works, because it's familiar, because it keeps you included. But Jung believed growth requires separation from outdated identities. When you outgrow a role and stay in it anyway, your presence stagnates. Irreplaceable people evolve in public. They allow their function to change. They stop over-delivering in places that no longer demand depth. They let some forms of usefulness die. That loss creates space, and space reveals what actually matters. 5. Risk being misunderstood. This is the line most people won't cross. They want clarity without discomfort, recognition without risk, presence without exposure. But understanding comes after expression, not before it. Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Self-expression disrupts expectations. That disruption is where identity forms. When you speak plainly, when you stop managing reactions, when you allow others to misread you temporarily. Your presence stops being neutral, and neutrality is always replaceable. 6. Choose depth over reach. Being everywhere makes you available. Being deep makes you missed. Irreplaceable people aren't constantly accessible. They invest selectively. They show up fully in fewer places. They allow distance where there's no resonance. This isn't withdrawal, it's precision. When your energy is diluted, your absence barely registers. When it's concentrated, it creates a vacuum. Depth creates attachment. Reach creates familiarity. Only one creates loss. 7. Stop negotiating your existence. You don't need to justify your presence to belong. When you over-explain, over-apologize, or over-perform to earn space, you signal that you're optional. Irreplaceable people don't force their presence. They assume it, not arrogantly, not aggressively, but quietly. Jung believed self-acceptance was the foundation of individuality. Without it, identity depends on external approval. When you stop negotiating your right to be there, others feel the shift, because people respond to certainty more than effort. Being irreplaceable isn't about becoming extraordinary, it's about becoming undeniable.